Her frail body trembled, and the puppies barely clung to life in the icy silence. All hope seemed lost until headlights pierced through the darkness. What happened next changed their lives forever. Every morning started the same. Runa would carefully step out of the abandoned cabin, feeling the biting frost seep into her paws. The cabin was old, with rotting wooden planks and broken windows that let in the icy wind. Once it might have been a home for someone, but now it was deserted, forgotten, and her only refuge. Inside the cabin, in a far corner, Runa had made a nest for her puppies. She had gathered old scraps of fabric from the wreckage and carefully arranged them, protecting her little ones like precious treasures. The puppies were still so small and fragile, their faint cries barely audible. Yet each sound they made gave Runa the strength to keep going, no matter how exhausted she was. The cabin stood on the edge of the forest, far from any roads or people. Runa knew it was unlikely anyone would find them here, but that also meant food was scarce. She had to venture farther and farther, scouring the area for anything that could sustain them. One morning, as she trudged through the snow, she discovered an old orchard behind the cabin. Lying there were frozen, rotting apples, remnants of a harvest long forgotten. She gathered as many as her weakening body would allow and dragged the meager bounty back to her pups. The apples wouldn't be enough to nourish them, but they might give the puppies a sliver of strength to keep fighting. The cabin was their fortress, but with each passing day, it grew colder. The freezing air seeped through the cracks in the walls, and heavy snow threatened to collapse the roof. Every night, Runa listened to the howling wind, always prepared to act if the cabin became unsafe. The puppies, still so tiny, huddled close to her, their small bodies desperately seeking warmth. Runa wrapped herself around them, using her own body to shield them from the cold. Every faint whimper pierced her heart, a painful reminder that time was running out and their chances of survival were growing slimmer. Despite her despair, Runa kept fighting. She searched not only for food, but also for anything that could make their shelter more bearable. Sometimes, she found old rags or burlap sacks and carried them back to the cabin. For most, these were useless scraps, but for Runa, they were another step towards saving her babies. Each evening, as snow blanketed the cabin, she lay beside her pups once more, wrapping them in her warmth. They didn't understand the danger surrounding them, but she did. The cabin was their last refuge, and Runa was ready to defend it with her life. Runa never thought her world could collapse so quickly. Her owner, once kind and caring, someone with whom she had spent the best years of her life, had suddenly changed. At first, there were subtle signs. He began paying less attention to her, disappearing from home more often, and sometimes even forgetting to feed her. She sensed something was wrong, but continued to greet him at the door with a wagging tail, hoping his mood would shift. But then, the truth became painfully clear. One day, he packed his belongings, discarded what he didn't need, and left Runa in the backyard without food or water. "You'll be fine," he muttered as he got into his car. Her eyes were filled with questions, but no answers came. Only the sound of the engine fading into the distance was left behind, leaving her surrounded by silence. Runa chased after the car for as long as her legs could carry her, until her paws burned with pain and exhaustion. He never looked back. For days, she sat by the side of the road, unable to believe she had been abandoned. She still waited, hoping he would return, that it had all been some mistake. But instead of her owner, only the cold and hunger came. Day by day, her strength waned. Soon she realized something else, something vital. She was pregnant. Her instincts screamed that she needed to find shelter, a safe place where she could give birth. Yet every door she approached remained shut. People chased her away, throwing rocks to keep her at a distance. One day, wandering aimlessly through the forest, she stumbled upon an abandoned shed. The door was ajar, and inside there was the damp smell of mold and decay. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than staying out in the freezing cold. She found a small corner where some hay lay scattered and curled up tightly, shivering as the chill sank into her bones. Weeks passed. Runa barely managed to find food, surviving on scraps she scavenged from the forest or the roadside. Her body grew weaker, but she pressed on, knowing she had to protect the lives growing inside her. Then the day came. The snowstorm howled, piling drifts against the walls of the shed, and the wind lashed at the fragile structure as if trying to tear it apart. Runa was alone, without help, without support. But she endured. One by one, 5 tiny puppies entered the world. They were so small, so fragile, that her heart broke with a mix of love and fear for them. She licked each of them gently, wrapping her body around them to shield them from the biting cold, trying to give them every ounce of warmth she could muster. From that moment, her life changed. She no longer thought about the betrayal she had endured or the pain of losing her home. Her sole purpose became survival. For her puppies. They were her meaning, her hope, her reason to keep fighting in a harsh and merciless world. The shed, though old and crumbling, became their sanctuary. It shielded them from the wind and snow, giving them a small reprieve from the unforgiving reality outside. But Runa knew it wasn't enough. She had to fight harder. She had to find a way to save her pups, even if it meant giving every last bit of herself. Rune emerged from the hut, hugging the ground tightly as the blizzard lashed her face with icy winds. Each paw sank into the deep snow, every step a grueling effort. The cold seeped into her very bones, and hunger gnawed at her belly with sharp, insistent pain. But she couldn't stop. She didn't have the right to stop. Her pups were waiting for her. Their faint, helpless cries echoed in her mind, driving her forward. She knew the forest like the back of her paw, but even for her, navigating this snowstorm was a challenge. Everything around her looked the same, white, barren, lifeless. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but she kept moving, even as every muscle screamed in protest. Rune remembered that there was an old shed nearby, something she'd stumbled upon once while searching for shelter. There might be something useful there, scraps of cloth or maybe even a bit of food. The hope of finding it became her only reason to keep going. When she finally reached the shed, she saw that its door was half buried under a drift of snow. Rune began to dig, clawing at the snow until she could squeeze inside. The air inside was dark and frigid, but at least it was protected from the wind. She began to search the shed, lowering her nose to the ground, sniffing every corner. In one spot, she found some old sacks and scraps of fabric, something that could help insulate the pup's nest. It wasn't much, but it was important. She started piling them up to take back with her, but then froze. Her ears caught a faint sound, just barely audible. It wasn't the wind or the creaking of old wooden beams. It was another living creature. Rune tensed, her heartbeat quickening. Turning her head, she noticed a shadow in the far corner of the shed. It was a cat. Thin, dirty, with narrowed eyes, it was curled up tightly, watching Rune. It looked just as cold and hungry as she felt. Rune wanted to growl, to protect her small stash, but instead, she simply stood there, staring at him. The cat, despite its frail appearance, didn't move. It just observed Rune, as if understanding that she had her own burdens to carry. She picked up one of the sacks in her teeth and headed toward the door. But before leaving, Rune paused and glanced back at the cat. She couldn't leave him here, not when she barely had enough for her own pups. Approaching him cautiously, she tilted her head, looking at him more closely. The cat stirred slightly, as if expecting her to attack. Instead, Rune leaned down and licked his ear gently, as if to say, "Come with me." The cat hesitated, but curiosity and hope outweighed his fear. Slowly, he stood up on shaky legs and followed Rune. When Rune returned to the hut, her legs could barely carry her. The pups stirred weakly, sensing the warmth of her body as she settled down beside them. She spread the sacks and scraps of fabric around their nest, bundling them up to keep them from freezing. The cat carefully settled in a far corner of the hut, keeping his distance from the pups. Rune looked at him, then back at her little ones. She knew that every life mattered, and even though she was starving, cold, and utterly exhausted, she still shared the little she had with those who needed it most. Her eyes no longer held despair. Instead, they were filled with determination. She understood that even in a world as dark as hers, there was room for kindness and hope. And though many more trials lay ahead, she knew she would fight to her last breath, for her pups, for a chance at new life, and for the small glimmer of hope that burned inside her. Runa gently cradled the puppy in her warm paws, pulling him closer to her body. Her fur, though frozen from the bitter cold, still carried enough warmth to offer him a small reprieve. She continued to lick him rhythmically, tenderly, as if trying to coax life back into his tiny, nearly lifeless body. Her breathing grew quicker, as though she was willing to share her own life force with him. The other puppies lay quietly, huddled together, their faint breathing filling the cabin with barely audible sounds. Runa cast a cautious glance at them, ensuring they were safe, but her focus remained fixed on this one frail pup, the weakest of the litter. The storm outside showed no mercy. The wind howled and battered against the walls of the cabin, while snow piled up, nearly obscuring the windows. Each gust of wind was a harsh reminder of how fragile life could be in this unforgiving world. But Runa couldn't let it win. She wouldn't. The puppy let out a faint sound, and his tiny paw twitched. It was a sign, proof that her efforts weren't in vain. Runa kept warming him, gently rocking her body as if to soothe him. Her heart raced anxiously, but with every passing moment, she felt a glimmer of hope. Slowly but surely, her determination seemed to be making a difference. Then, suddenly, the puppy opened his tiny mouth and took a deep, shaky breath. Runa froze, watching intently. Her eyes widened, and she let out a soft, almost imperceptible howl, a quiet expression of her relief and joy. Carefully, she placed the puppy back with his brothers and sisters, wrapping them all together in the scraps of fabric she had managed to gather. Runa pressed herself against them, curling her body to shield them from the cold. Her sole focus now was to keep them warm and alive. In the corner of the cabin, a cat sat watching. Runa had brought him in from the barn earlier. Curled into a ball, his eyes, once dull and empty, now glimmered with curiosity. He observed how this dog fought fiercely for her pups, pouring every ounce of her strength into their survival without hesitation or complaint. For a brief moment, Runa lifted her head and met the cat's gaze. An unspoken understanding passed between them. She knew he was hungry and cold, but in that moment, they both recognized what mattered most, saving those who were even more vulnerable. Exhausted, Runa rested her head on her paws, wrapping herself protectively around the puppies. Their breathing grew steadier, their small bodies slowly warming. Though her strength was fading, the sound of their fragile but steady breaths filled her with peace. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, but within the cabin, a faint, fragile warmth had taken hold. It was her small victory in this endless battle against the cold. And despite her exhaustion, Runa knew she would keep fighting until the very end. Because she was a mother, and her heart was full of a love strong enough to defy even the harshest winter nights. The next day, when the wind had calmed a little, Runa set out again to look for food. This time she was drawn to the sound of a distant tractor working nearby. She crept closer, staying hidden in the shadows of the trees. The man driving the tractor seemed enormous and intimidating to her. He was unloading something from the back of the machine. Her sharp eyes caught sight of several pieces of food falling onto the snow. Her instincts screamed that it was too dangerous to approach, but her hunger told her otherwise. She waited until the man walked away and then darted toward the food. She managed to grab one piece but was spotted. The man stopped and looked at her intently. He didn't move, didn't try to come closer. He just stood there, as if waiting for her to decide what to do. Runa froze, trembling. There was no anger or threat in his eyes, just weariness and something that looked like compassion. "You're not alone, are you?" he said softly. His voice was calm and gentle. Runa took a step back but didn't run. Slowly, he extended his hand, holding a piece of bread. She hesitated, but something deep inside told her he wouldn't hurt her. Runa stood still, carefully studying the man's face. The cold air squeezed her lungs, but she didn't look away. There was something in his eyes that reminded her of times when humans had been kind to her. But the pain and fear she carried were still too fresh for her to fully trust. The man didn't rush. He stayed perfectly still, trying not to scare her. His voice broke the silence again, soft and warm. "I won't hurt you. I promise." Runa cautiously took another step back, clutching the piece of bread she had already grabbed. She was torn. Should she stay, accept his help, or run back to her puppies? The man placed the bread on the snow and stepped back a few paces, showing her he wasn't going to force anything. "If you want, you can take it," he said, pointing to the food. "You need to survive, don't you?" His words were soothing, and Runa, still watching him closely, moved toward the food he had left behind. Her paws pressed into the snow, leaving faint tracks as she walked. When she reached the bread, she quickly snatched it up and took a few steps back. But instead of running off immediately, she paused. The man knelt down, making himself less intimidating. He looked directly into her eyes, and his gaze held understanding. "Do you have a family? Puppies?" he asked, as if he already knew the answer. Those words made her even more cautious. She had never trusted anyone except herself, but looking at this man, she felt like he might understand her pain. Slowly, she turned and began walking toward the forest, glancing over her shoulder to see if he was following. The man hesitated, but when he saw her look back, he realized she wanted him to follow. "You want to show me something, don't you?" he said quietly as he stood up. Runa led him through the forest, weaving between snow-covered trees. The man followed, careful to make as little noise as possible. He sensed that every step he took could frighten her, but her actions told him she trusted him enough to bring him to something important. When they reached an old cabin, Runa stopped at the door, watching him closely. She didn't move until he stepped forward. The man opened the door and froze when he saw what was inside. On a pile of old rags lay 5 tiny puppies. Their little bodies were frail and thin, but they were alive, huddling together for warmth. The man knelt down slowly, his heart aching at the sight. "Oh, you poor things," he whispered, reaching out to the closest puppy. His fingers were warm and gentle, and the puppy stirred faintly. Runa stood off to the side, her watchful eyes filled with worry. She didn't move, but her gaze revealed all her anxiety. The man turned to her and spoke softly. "You've been keeping them alive all this time, haven't you? You're incredible." He took off his jacket and laid it on the floor, carefully wrapping the puppies in it to keep them warm. Then he pulled some food from his bag and placed a small bowl of water he had brought from the tractor nearby. Runa moved closer, still wary, but now there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. She watched as the man cared for her pups, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't alone. "We'll figure this out," he said, looking up at her. "I promise. Everything will be okay now." And at that moment, Runa knew she had made the right choice. This man was their chance at survival. Runa walked slowly through the forest, glancing back every so often to make sure the man was following her. She moved cautiously, checking to see if he might fall behind or grow wary of her intentions. His footsteps crunched evenly and steadily through the snow, and despite the biting cold, he never stopped. He understood that this strange journey of his was leading to something profoundly important. With every step, Runa felt her anxiety grow. She was leading him to where her little ones were waiting, shivering in the cold, weak, and helpless. She knew their time was running out, and her heart ached at the thought of being too late. Yet, deep inside, a fragile hope flickered. This man might be able to help. When they finally reached the cabin, the man paused at the doorway. Runa cast him one last worried glance, as if silently asking, "Are you sure you won't harm them?" In return, he gave her a gentle look and quietly said, "Don't worry, girl. I'm here to help." Runa nudged the door open with her nose and stepped inside, holding her breath. The man followed her in but froze as soon as he entered. In the corner of the small cabin, lying on a pile of old rags, were 5 tiny puppies. Their frail bodies barely moved, and their weak whimpers were faint, as if they were too exhausted to cry out. "Oh my God," the man whispered, his voice filled with shock and compassion. Runa went to the puppies, lay down beside them, and wrapped them in her body. She kept her eyes fixed on the man, her gaze a mix of pleading and cautious distrust. Her eyes spoke more than words ever could. "Help them. I can't do any more on my own." The man knelt down slowly, making sure not to startle her. He examined the puppies carefully, noting their frailty, frost-bitten paws, and labored breathing. His chest tightened with emotion. He reached into his bag, pulling out warm blankets, which he carefully spread out near their makeshift nest. "You're incredible," he said, looking at Runa. "You've done so much for them, but now it's my turn to help." He got to work quickly, his movements focused and deliberate. In one corner of the cabin, he found some old pieces of wood that could be used for a fire. He stepped outside briefly, returning with a small bundle of dry twigs he'd kept in his car. Starting a fire in a cabin like this was risky, but he did it carefully, building a small flame inside a metal bucket to contain the heat and keep it safe from the old, fragile walls. As the faint warmth began to fill the cabin, the man pulled a bottle of water and a bowl from his bag, pouring out a small amount of liquid. He placed it in front of Runa, but she didn't move. Her eyes never left the puppies. He realized she wouldn't eat or drink as long as her babies were in danger. Gently, he wrapped each puppy in the blankets, making sure they were snug and warm. One of the puppies was particularly weak, its tiny body barely responsive. The man picked it up and began carefully massaging its paws to stimulate circulation. "Come on, little one, fight," he murmured, warming the puppy with his breath. Runa watched him closely. She could feel her tension slowly giving way to trust. This man wasn't here to harm them. His care and attention were genuine. Under the warm blankets, the puppies began to stir, their breathing becoming steadier. The man took a piece of bread and some soft food from his bag, offering it to Runa. This time, she didn't refuse. She ate quickly, but her watchful eyes remained on him the whole time. When everything was done, the man sat down on the floor near the fire. He rested his hand on the ground, leaving it within Runa's reach but not touching her. She hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. Her eyes filled with gratitude as she cautiously laid her head on his hand. He spoke softly. "You're safe now. Everything's going to be okay. I promise." For the first time in what felt like forever, Runa felt she wasn't alone. Her puppies were breathing, their tiny bodies soaking in the warmth, and next to her was a human who was willing to help them start a new life. In that moment, she realized their long, painful journey might finally be over, and salvation was within reach.